So that song that was playing there is called The Sacred War. At least in English, that's the name of it. It was written in 1941. It's one of the most patriotic songs in the history of the Soviet Union, and is still seen as a very patriotic song, as you see there in that video in Russia today. I think that video was from like 2009. You can see the people stood up. It's not the national anthem of Russia, but it's kind of like "God Bless America" or some other song that means a lot to Russian people, and the former Soviet peoples too. But it's mostly used in Russia today. But the Soviet Union was invaded, as I began to talk about here, in Operation Barbarossa. While there were some peoples in the western part of the Soviet Union who certainly hated Stalin, many Ukrainians actually tried to fight with the Germans after that. There were many in the Baltic states who also were certainly pleased that the Soviets were driven out by the Germans. However, the German occupation force turned out to be not much better for many of those people too. So a lot of them got caught in the middle. Many of them fought both. But eventually, most of the people in those territories came to side against the Germans. The German occupation was pretty brutal, particularly for Jews, but not just for Jews. We'll talk more about that in the future. But this area. There were millions of Jews who lived in Poland and the western part of the Soviet Union. And that is most of the Jews who were killed in the event that we know as the Holocaust, too. So these are connected. But the invasion that took place in 41 did fail ultimately. They were not able to win in 1941, and once they got bogged down in the Soviet Union, it became clear it was going to be difficult for the Germans to win. Although even in early 1942, they were still on the advance in their mind. But once it became a war of attrition for the Germans, it became a big problem. And make no mistake about this. I'm utterly convinced of this, and I think most historians would agree with me. The war in Europe was won and lost on the Russian front, in the Eastern Front, between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. That's simply the facts. As much as an American, I think D-Day was a great thing. Heroic act. I've been to the cemetery at D-Day. It's a moving place. I have a great uncle who died, not at D-Day, but about 10 days later. I never knew him, but my grandmother talked about him all the time. He was her closest brother. And, those are great things, but the reality is that the war in Europe really ended up being between the Soviets and Nazi Germany. For good, bad, ill, however you want to look at it, that's what happened. So that's what we do in history. We talk about what happened. So, I don't know where I'm going there. Oh yeah, we already talked about that. So there's the map. Just to review those notes for you. I'll pretend like I meant to do that. So again, that's what happened by the end of early 42. Now, what else happened, of course, during this time period? Something very important happened, right? Japan had become an ally. I think they became a formal ally in 1940 with the Germans and Italians, completing the Axis alliance, although it was never really that tight of an alliance. Allied propaganda, particularly American propaganda during the war, there's a couple of famous films that depict this as, there was this alliance of these three powers trying to take over the world, and you could argue that to some extent. But in reality, the Japanese and the Germans, particularly, who were the really two powerful sides, weren't that connected. Obviously, they weren't fighting against each other, and they had common enemies, but that's really was the extent of it. Now, as I told you already, Japan was already at war in China by 1938, 37, 38. And I'm going to go back and mention that in later notes. We're going to talk about Japan and China. But in July of 1941, Japan expanded its military occupation into other territories, and they moved into what's called Indochina. Indochina is south of China. This would be Southeast Asia, basically what today would be Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. That area was actually a French colony at the time, interestingly enough, which would have been Vichy French colony, right? But Japan occupies this territory. They're trying to expand their empire. I have a map. You'll see what I'm talking about here in a second. They're trying to create the greater East Asian empire. In response to this, the United States, which was not at war with Japan yet, froze Japanese assets. And both U.S. and Britain, essentially Britain was at war with Japan now, but both of them froze Japanese assets in their banks. And U.S. and Britain both cut off oil supply. So I guess Britain had been still supplying Japan, probably hoping that Japan would not be too closely allied with the Germans. Both Britain and the U.S. essentially said, we're not going to give you oil anymore. We're not going to sell you oil anymore. And Japan needed the oil. They needed the natural resources. And U.S. basically put today what we would call sanctions on Japan. Okay? And the Japanese saw this as an act of war. And so they began devising a plan. And we know what happened, right? On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese stealthily attacked the American port in Hawaii at Pearl Harbor, which had the Pacific Fleet. And it was a very successful attack by the Japanese. That's a picture there you can see. They destroyed, let's see if I get this right, most of the American battleships. Fortunately, many are all of, I think, I'm not positive about that, but most of the aircraft carriers were not at port there. And aircraft carriers turned out to be very important in the Pacific War, right? That was a new thing in the airplanes and aircraft carriers in the Pacific War. Pacific Ocean's really big, having those planes to fly around. I mean, the planes that attacked Pearl Harbor and Hawaii came from aircraft carriers. Now, the Japanese, this was in some ways, in retrospect, an act of desperation. It turned out to be a really bad idea for the Japanese ultimately because they get beat badly in World War II, okay, very badly. And it also essentially woke up the United States and brought the United States into not just the Pacific War against the Japanese, but also into the European North African theater also, okay? So now you have the United States on December 8th. Roosevelt goes to Congress, gives his famous speech, the Day of Infamy speech, and Japan is at war with the United States, obviously, and the United States ultimately will join with Britain and the Soviet Union in a war against Germany and Italy. Now, what's interesting about that is both Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. Both Hitler and Mussolini give speeches where they declare war on the United States. You used to be able to find those speeches on the internet. I cannot find them anymore, so take that for what it's worth. I wish I could. So now you have the United States in the war, and it is a real world war, right? Big battles in the Pacific. First early big battles in the Pacific were the Battle of Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway. Both, generally speaking, American victories, and both guaranteed that the war was going to be going towards Japan and not the other way. As I said, Japan was never going to invade the United States, right? They weren't capable really of doing that. They were capable of hitting the United States pretty hard in certain cases, but there were fears of that, obviously, but it was never going to happen. Now, we're going to come back to the Pacific. You'll see, I'll show you a map of both the Pacific and the European theaters at some point. The Allied response in the European North African theater, basically the Mediterranean world, the Allies land in North Africa in November 1942. So the Allies here are basically American and British, although you will have Free French forces join this too. And I'll show you this on the map. So they'll land in North Africa on the west coast of North Africa, all right? And the British army was already in Egypt. Now, the Germans and the Italians had occupied a big portion of North Africa and were pushing towards the Middle East. They wanted to drive the British out of Egypt and take control of the Middle East. People were already becoming conscious somewhat of oil, although oil in other places was more important to the Germans at this point. But in this way, their plan was to cut the world in two, essentially, and link up coming south out of Russia and north into the Middle East. Well, that didn't happen because the British and the Allies beat them. The Americans and British beat the Italians and Germans in North Africa. And by middle part of 1943, the Germans and the Italians had left North Africa, and the Allies had gone into Sicily. As you can see there on the dates there, July, August 1943. The Allies are in Sicily, and basically the plan was to move. There's a southern front now going against what was called the soft underbelly of the Axis, which essentially was Sicily and Italy. The man in the picture there is George Patton, who is a pretty well-known American general. Famous movie made about him. He was a famous tank commander. Now, in 1943, as the Allies do move into Italy, Mussolini is actually kicked out of power. He's ousted, as I say there. The Italians realize things aren't going well, and many Italians are really not happy with the results of World War, what's happening in the war at the time. So they kicked Mussolini out. But the Germans realize this, and they actually move down and take control of essentially all of North Italy from Rome north. So probably actually more than just northern Italy, pretty far south. And you have an Italian front that really exists there for another year or so. But it's mostly Germans fighting. And they set up Mussolini in kind of this rump government in the north, but it's really a German deal by this time. Now, yeah, look at the map. You can see all this. So you can see this is where the Americans and British land here. This was a French area, but it was Vichy French. Most of the French do switch sides to the Allies. Here's the British control of Egypt here. The main battle here was called the Battle of El Alamein, where the British defeat the Germans, and there's the Allies going into southern Italy, okay? In the east, right, the next thing we're gonna talk about, and I think I'm gonna wait on this because I don't want to start on it yet, but that's gonna be the key battle in 1942 and early 1943. And really that battle's in 1942. So the Germans make it all the way in 1942. They're going south here. And they're trying to go south here to get over here to there's oil fields here. Remember I told you, the Germans wanted to go up here this way, and they wanted to come south that way. And they could have linked up, see, here, and cut the British off from the British Empire, from India, right? That's the Suez Canal. And the Germans wanted to link up here. Well, they were stopped here at